Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's webinar on associate agreements and contracts. We are honored to have our speaker, Dr. Charles Incalcaterra, presenting tonight. He is retired as the director of the general practice residency at Lehigh Valley Hospital in 2022, after serving 27 years and mentoring over 100 residents. He is still an attending dentist at that hospital, as well as Christiana Hospital in Wilmington, Delaware. He also retired from private practice in April of 2024, almost 1 year ago, after 40 years in practice. Dr. Incalcaterra is a member of the Pennsylvania Dental Association, the American Dental Association, Second District Dental Association, and the Lehigh Valley Dental Society. He served in many leadership positions throughout his membership, most recently as the president of the Pennsylvania Dental Association in 2019 to 2020. He is also a member of the International College of Dentists, Pierre Fauchard Dental Academy, and the American College of Dentists. He also serves as a delegate to the American Dental Association. Dr. Incalcaterra has a lot of experience with advanced training enrollees and is very knowledgeable in guiding dental students and new dentists. We are so pleased to have him sharing his knowledge with you tonight as we jump into tonight's presentation on associate agreements and contracts. And please type any questions you have in the chat and they will be answered at the end. And this webinar should last approximately an hour. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everybody. Appreciate you being here tonight. I know it's a busy time of year for you. You're probably getting close to the end of this semester. So I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy lives to be here for this presentation tonight. As Amanda said, I was the program director for 27 years at Lehigh Valley Health Network. And over the years, residents have gotten contracts and asked me to take a look at them. They also asked a number of their other mentors in the hospital to take a look as well. And over the time, I noticed a number of things that were somewhat disturbing to me. A contract basically is that, the person that writes the contract wants what they want, and the person that's getting the contract wants what they want. And in the end, everybody should be a little unhappy with the agreement that they come to, so that you're satisfied with it, but you don't get everything you want, and neither does the practice owner that's trying to hire you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different parts of the contract tonight, and there's quite a bit of information here, so bear with me. There's a lot to go through. The last about a dozen slides are some samples of contracts that I've seen over the year. I'm going to point out some of the things that were good about those and some of those things that were not so good, so you have some real life examples of those as well. So every time we do a lecture, I always like to talk about the objectives of the lecture, what you're going to get out of this tonight. So by the end of this presentation, you'll have an understanding of the importance and reasons for having a written contract, have a better understanding of the different components of the associate contract, understand the difference between being classified as an employee or an independent contractor. And we're going to spend a lot of time on that. That's very important, and you'll see why as we get into this. Understand the different methods of compensation available to you as an associate, whether you're classified as an employee or an independent contractor. That makes a big difference. Understand the need for a professional review of the contract and those people that you need to contact, the resources that you need for reviewing a contract. Now, I will tell you that most of these contracts that I reviewed are with private practices. There have been a few with some corporate practices, but not that many. So these are primarily based on private practice review. But I think a lot of the information I'm going to give you to look at tonight is going to be pertinent to both corporate as well as private practices. Some of the other objectives is the written contract, causes the parties to address and focus on issues about which they might not have otherwise thought about. Some examples are compensation method, resolution of payments at the termination of the agreement, rights of the associate to examine the office's financial records, and the associate's responsibilities in managing the office if there are any. Some other things that are important about a contract is it protects the associate and the owner in the case of a dispute. It's to resolve ambiguity and eliminate confusions, especially with respect to compensation, termination, restrictive covenants, and duties. It's also as a reminder as what was expected to and agreed upon versus a verbal agreement, which is really, again, as I said last week, not worth the paper it's written on. Some of the essential elements of a contract are as follows. The status of the associate, whether you're an employee or an independent contractor, the schedule and location of services and the duties that you're going to perform, Malpractice insurance, who covers that? Who pays for it? The duties of the owner and associate, for example, on-call schedule, management duties, etc. Compensation and benefits to the associate, including organized dentistry benefits, who pays for that? And any business-related expenses, for example, lab fees or special equipment and supplies that you may want. Some of the other parts of the essential elements are the patient charts and records and the ability of the associate to access those records if necessary after termination, whether that be to finalize your payments that are due to you, or in the case of a malpractice suit that you have to defend, you want to have access to those records. Staffing for the associate, is that going to be provided, especially for as a dental assistant? Is that going to be provided to you? The covenant not to compete or solicit patients or staff. We're going to talk a lot about that as well today. Confidentiality and trade secrets that the practice may want to protect, and the associate's ability to buy in the future as a partner, and any attorney's fees are going to be addressed in a contract as well. So if there's a breach of the contract, there's usually a clause in there that will talk about attorney's fees and who's responsible for those. So what should you be looking for in a contract? And I apologize if the block on the right here is causing you to not be able to see. Let me see if I can do anything about that there. There we go. I think that'll work better. Good. So the what should be looking in the contract? Believe it or not, I've seen contracts where the names of the parties involved weren't on there, so you want to make sure you do have that. Does the contract automatically renew at the end of the term, which is called an evergreen? It automatically renews, or does a new one need to be negotiated every year? And what's the time period for letting each party know when we're going to end the contract? The hours per day and the days of the week the associate will work. Does the office have more than one location? Is the associate expected to perform services there as well? Responsibility to cover office hours after emergencies, or after hours for emergencies. Time off for vacation, illness, continuing education, and whether this is with or without pay, and how much advance notice that the practice requires. Fringe benefits such as health insurance, life insurance, malpractice insurance, 401k, bonuses, continuing education, ADA dues, etc. And if the contract refers to an employee manual, you need to have access to that before you sign the contract. And then how are new patients allocated? Is it every other new patient that comes in, or is there a different method that's done for that? And how the contract can be terminated by either party, and how does payment for services rendered occur after the contract is terminated? Other things you should be looking for is a restrictive covenant, which is reasonable and justified with regards to the duration and geographic area. For example, an urban area is going to have a smaller restrictive covenant diameter versus a rural area that may have a larger restrictive covenant geographic area. And I always recommend that new associates should consider negotiating a phased-in restrictive covenant so they're not excluded from practicing in an area if the contract is terminated shortly after it begins. Sometimes things go south rather rapidly. You think you might found the best practice, and you're there for like a month, and all of a sudden you just found out that it's not what you were promised, and you want to get out of this contract. And if you're only there for a month or 2 or 3 months, what's the risk to the practice of you leaving and taking all those patients with you? So I feel that practice should have a phased and restrictive covenant for you. Um, If a buy-in or a partnership is contemplated, a specific method of payment to the practice should be stipulated, and a trial period should be stipulated. Usually that's 6 months to a year. Space available for the associate, which will include operatories, equipment, supplies, and assistance, like we talked about. Method of payment, including compensation for hygiene exams, work that needs to be redone. So if another dentist in the practice did something and you have to do it over, how are you going to be compensated for that? Any lab fees, and any no charge procedures done by the dentist in the practice. So again, if a crown goes bad and that other practitioner has left the practice and you're left to redo that, how do you get compensated for that, especially if the practice is not going to charge them for that? And then if there's any chain of command for any administrative decisions that the associate may make without approval of the owner. So that should be stipulated in the contract as well. So you know how much responsibility you have and what type of things that you're allowed to be a manager of, and what are the things that you're not allowed to. For example, is it buying equipment and stuff like that, buying supplies? So we're going to spend some time talking about the employee versus the independent contractor. And this has a lot to do with the IRS rules. You will see contracts oftentimes call you an independent contractor. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about this, but I'll tell you right now that you're going to soon see that most times you would not be, by IRS rules and regulations, an independent contractor. For the most part, you're going to be an employee. But again, you're going to see sometimes contracts will call you an independent contractor, and we'll see why that is. So for an employee, the employer or the owner of the practice can control what will be done and how it will be done. The employee follows the employer's directions with respect to when and where to work, purchase of supplies, equipment, hiring of staff, choice of lab, etc. Whereas an independent contractor, the employer or the owner dentist has the right only to control the results of the work and not the means and methods of accomplishing that result. So, for example, you're probably taught to use a certain impression material for a denture. And, if you come in as an independent contractor, you could use whatever impression material you want. You don't have to go with what the employer says. If you decide you're going to use alginate and stock tray to make your dentures, that's up to you because you're an independent contractor. But if the practitioner says, no, you have to use a custom tray and use a vinyl polysiloxane material, then that you're considered an employee because they're telling you what to do. So the independent contractors determine their method for performing the work, which is ordered by the owner. They control their own hours, fees, work routines, and schedules. So those are IRS rules. So if any of the following questions are answered yes, that means that you as an associate would be an employee. So number one is, does the employer provide instructions to the associate about when, where, and how the work he or she is to perform? Must a service be personally rendered by the associate? Usually yes. Is there a continuing relationship between the owner and associate? So if you have a contract, yes, you do have a continuing relationship. Does the owner provide any training to the associate? And oftentimes, as a new employee, you would get some training, especially with respect to how they want things done, et cetera. Are the services provided by the associate integrated into the owner's business operations? Obviously, yes. Does the owner set the hours and work schedule? Does the owner hire, supervise, and pay assistants for the associate? And does the associate devote this substantially full time to the business of the owner? That one's a little tricky because you could be working a couple of part-time positions, but essentially full-time means that you're there a significant amount of time. And again, you'll see a little bit of the reason why you would be considered an employee versus a independent contractor. Other yes questions, that means that you're an employee. Is the work performed on the owner's premises? Obviously, yes. And I'm going to go over that in a few seconds. Is the associate required to perform the service in an order or sequence that's set by the owner? Does the owner have the right to discharge the associate at will? And in Pennsylvania and probably some other states too, employments are at will. So obviously, yes, you can be discharged at will. That would make you an employee. Is the associate required to submit oral or written reports to the owner? Obviously, you're going to have to be putting chart notes in. Is the associate paid by the hour, week, or month? Does the owner pay the business or travel expenses of the associate? So let me give you an example of an independent contractor, not in dentistry. So I own Charlie's plumbing supply business, okay? And I hire different plumbers as independent contractors. And you call me up and say, hey, I want my toilet replaced and I want a new sink put in. And I go, okay, I'm going to do that. Well, I'm going to send the independent contractor that I hired. They're not my employee. And what they're allowed to do is go over to your house, take the measurements, design the bathroom, fabricate the work, possibly offsite. They might make the cabinetry and the sinks and everything, put that all together offsite, bring it in, and then you pay me and I pay them. I don't control when they're there. I just give them the job to do and they take care of it on their own and do it whenever they want and however they want. So that's an independent contractor. Now, if they're my employee, that employee would come back to work at my shop, build the cabinetry there. I would supply them with all the supplies necessary, all the tools necessary for that cabinet making, provide the sinks that they're going to put into the cabinetry, into the into the bathroom. So get the toilet, get everything done for them. So you can kind of see the difference if you think about it that way. what an independent contractor is versus what an employee is. And for the most part, again, you're going to see that it's very rare that a dentist would be a independent contractor. So if you answer yes to the following questions, that means that you're an independent contractor. So as I mentioned, did the associate supply the tools, the materials, the equipment, et cetera? Are you bringing in your tools? Are you taking those tools home and sterilizing them off site? Obviously, you're not going to be doing that. Does the associate provide services to more than one firm or dental practice at a time? Again, if I hire that plumbing assistant, they could be working for a number of different firms, not just for me. Can the associate terminate their relationship with the owner at any time he or she wishes? Usually in a contract, you're going to have a time limit where they say to you, you have to give me 3 months before you can leave the practice, or 6 months, whatever their termination is. So as an independent contractor, you could just walk away. And can the associate realize a profit or a loss as a result of their services? Again, I hired that plumbing assistant. I'm saying to them, I'm going to give you $5,000 to do this job, and something goes wrong and they have to redo it, and it costs them money, and they actually lost $1,000 because they didn't do the job right the first time. So in dentistry, that's usually not going to happen. And does the associate have a significant investment in the facilities and their own equipment? We kind of mentioned that already. Does the associate make those services available to the general public? And does the associate pay their own Social Security taxes and make appropriate payments to the IRS on a monthly or quarterly basis? That's a big one right there. So as an independent contractor, you're responsible for full taxes that are paid to the IRS. If you ever have worked and you're an employee, you may see that about 7.6% of your gross pay is taken out and given to the government. It's either SUI or there's another FICA, I think it's called. Okay. And that's Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes. What you don't realize is that the employer, me as an employer, pays the other 7.6%. So I take 7.6% out of your pay. I match that 7.6%, and I'm sending the government every quarter 14 or 15.2% of your wages to the government to cover those costs. As an independent contractor, those taxes are not taken out, so you're responsible to pay the government that full 15%. So you're not paying only 7.6%, but you're paying double that. You're paying over 15%. So that's an important distinction between an employee and independent contractors. Other things to know is that employees are protected by federal and state regulations regarding anti-discrimination, overtime pay, and unemployment compensation. They're responsible for filing only their personal end-of-year taxes. And as I mentioned, independent contractors, they're not protected under certain federal state laws with respect to anti-discrimination, overtime pay, or unemployment compensation, and they must make monthly or quarterly business taxes and pay their own FICA, like I mentioned earlier, the Social Security taxes. So that's a big distinction between an independent contractor and an employee. So my advice to you, if you ever see a contract that says you'd be acted as an independent contractor, know that that's probably not true. And I would try to negotiate out of that. Or there's another way to get around that, and that's to actually ask for more money. Because if you have to pay that extra 7.6% in income taxes to the federal government, let's say you're getting compensated at 30% of collections, well, you have to cover an additional 7%. So you really want 37% of collections, not 30%, because you have to pay those taxes. And you probably have to hire an accountant also to do that for you. So that's a very important distinction. So there's different types of associate relationships. We just mentioned the employee-employer relationship or the independent contractor relationship. There's the opportunity to buy in where the associate, but where the buyer brings in an associate with the specific intent of that associate buying a percentage of the ownership in the practice or a partnership. The option to buy is often comes after a specific trial period, usually about 12 months. And it's suggested prior to drawing up the legal purchasing documents. So if you're going to become an associate with the intention of buying in, usually, again, there's about a year buy-in to make sure everybody feels each other out, and then they would write up a separate agreement for you to buy the practice. Now, I know that sometimes you're going into a family practice, or there could be a doctor that, he was your childhood dentist and you know and trust them, and they're ready to bring you in and buy out. And that's fine if you're very familiar with the practice. But if you're not really familiar with the practice, again, I recommend at least a year to feel each other out. And then the last one is a buyout, where the arrangements are similar to a buy-in, with the exception that the associate intends to purchase the entire practice, either again right away or after a specific period of time. One of my residents at previous resident from Lehigh Valley Health Network just sent me that she's being offered to buy into a practice. The practice is appraised at 823,000, so her buy-in would be 411,500, and they're going to take $17,000 of her production every month and put that toward the purchase of the practice. It's a high volume practice. They're doing a lot of work, and she said she's grossing about 52,000 a year, and they take 17,000 out and put that toward the buy-in of the practice, which I think would give her about 24 months to be a 50% partner. So that's actually a really nice deal. But that's how they're doing it. They're not actually making her go get the money. They're just taking out of her pay. So that's just something to be aware of. That's an option to do, to buy in or buy out. One of the important things about a buy-in or buyout agreement is that an appraisal of the practice is essential. I had my practice appraised before I sold it a year ago when I retired, and I think it cost me around 2,500 or $3,000 for that appraisal. Seems like a lot of money, but if you're putting $411,000 into a practice, it's worthwhile to determine if the asking price that the owner is asking is in fact real. So I always recommend that you determine the final price, because by getting your own independent appraisal. So if the price of the practice is based on the production after you have been there for a number of years, let's say you start the practice in 2025, and in 2028, you've been there 3 years, you're growing the practice, and the owner says, okay, I'm going to sell the practice. And by the way, the practice when you got here was worth 1 million, but now it's worth 1.5 because you've been putting all this work and growing my practice for me. So I'm going to sell you the practice for 1.5. Well, that's not really fair, because you're the one that brought in all that extra production, right? So you didn't walk in there at a $1.5 million practice and just keep things afloat. You actually built the practice up. So now you're being forced to pay for your own production. So my recommendation is that you have the valuation of the practice done back to when you started. So if they say like I said, you started in 25, and in 28, they say, yeah, we're going to sell the practice to you. Okay, let's go back and look at the practice value from 28, 27, 26, 25, 24. So look at the 5 years before I got here, and let's see what the production was, because that's the true value of the practice, in my opinion. All right, we're going to talk about different methods of compensation. And this gets a little bit complex, but it's important, again, that you be aware of these different options here, because I think some of them are very helpful. So in the beginning, it's really nice to have a straight salary. They just say to you, you're going to get $800 a day. Okay, you're making $100 an hour, whatever the number is going to be. I'm not saying what's right or what's wrong, but they're just going to give you X number of dollars per day for being there. That's usually going to last about 6 to 12 months. The nice thing about that is you're just coming out of school or a residency program. You need to get an apartment. You may have student loans that are now due, that you really want to make sure you're getting those under control. And if you wait for the compensation methods that I'm going to talk about later, sometimes there's a delay in getting paid. It might take a month before some of the payments come in from the insurance companies that you can get paid with. So it's nice to have a set straight salary for about 6 to 12 months. The only downside for the practice is there's little or no incentive for you to produce a lot. You're getting paid the same whether you do a crown or whether you're doing a prophy, God forbid. So there's no incentive really for you to really do a lot of high-end work with that. So the other option is option two there you see on the screen there, the straight salary with a commission. So the straight salary provides financial security for the associate, and the possibility of a bonus if a certain quota is exceeded works as an incentive. So they might say, it's going to be $100 a day, but if you reach this level, we're going to give you another $50 an hour. So it's going to be 150 an hour. Or it might be, let's say, $5,000 a week. But if you reach a level where you're pulling in $20,000, we'll give you an extra $1,000 bonus every week, whatever it's going to be. So there's different ways of doing this bonus. Usually it's a percentage over a set goal. And oftentimes it's either paid monthly, quarterly, sometimes semi-annually, but monthly or quarterly is more common. Then the next method is payment by commission, by either one of these two methods that you see on your screen here. Just as a note, from a business standpoint, the owner should not pay an associate greater than the practice's net profit. And what do I mean with their net percentages? So when I bring in, my income for the month, and then I pay my lab bill, I pay my electrical utilities, I pay the gas, I pay the phone, I pay the staff, I pay all these different things that come into running a practice, supplies, equipment, et cetera, maintenance. At the end of the month, it might be 65% goes toward paying those fees, 70% going toward paying those fees. So I'm making 30 or 35% at the end of a month. So I should never pay you more than I'm making. So in other words, if I'm bringing in 30%, that should be the exact percentage that you make as an associate. So that's my recommendation, is that the owner should not pay an associate greater than the practice's profit percentage. The option on the left here is production. This is based on a percentage of the work that you produce by the associate, not what's collected, but what you actually produce. And that's actually an easier way of maintaining things and managing things from your end, because at the end of the day, you know how many crowns you did, how many composites that you did, whatever you did, extractions, endos, etc. You know at the end of the day that I produce this much money, and I'm going to get a certain percentage of that money. Um, Net production, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but in fact, let's just talk about net production right now. Net production, and this is when, if you were with me last week and I was talking to you about the way the practices participate with different insurance companies. What happens is, let's say a crown is $1,500 for a patient that's paying full fee. They come in, they pay $1,500 for the crown. You're on a 30% production. That means you're going to get paid $500 for that crown. All right. Now, it turns out that the patient has Delta dental insurance, and Delta doesn't pay $1,500 for the crown. They only pay $800 for the crown. So you're getting now 30% of the $800 because they can't balance bill the patient if they participate with Delta insurance. So you're getting 30% of 800, you're getting $240, you're not getting $500. So net production is what the practice actually collects based on what the insurance is that they participate and what their fee schedules are. That's why it was very important for me last week to say to you, when you go into an interview, and when you do these contracts as well, find out what type of practice this is. Is this a practice that's participating with a lot of insurance companies that have set fee schedules that are lower than their normal fees? Or is it what we call an indemnity practice? An indemnity practice is one that collects their full fee no matter what. So you have Delta insurance. Sorry, I don't participate. We'll submit that insurance for you. You'll get that check from Delta, but my fee is $1,500, and you have to pay me before we get this crown done. So that's an indemnity practice, but a practice that has a lot of other insurances that they participate with will have a lower overall fee that they actually collect. So they might collect 100% of that Delta $800. So their collection rate is 100%. But really, when you compare it to the $1,500, it's really not. So net production is what they expect to get paid based on their participation and what they actually get paid. So that's the important thing about net production. Again, production method is a simpler for you to calculate for the practice as well as the associate. The other option is payment by commission on collections. This is based on the money collected by the practice for the associate's work. This makes the associate somewhat more responsible for controlling costs in the practice. For example, orthodontic practices usually pay on collections due to payment plans that the patients are enrolled in and the chance of the patient leaving at the practice prior to completion of the treatment. So if you're in an ortho practice, and I haven't seen a lot of ortho contracts, I'll be honest with you, but that's usually how they do it. They do it on collections because the patients are usually paying on a monthly basis. And again, there could be that the parents get divorced and the child no longer comes to the practice, or the parents move, or they just stop coming. So that's the method that you usually see. But you'll see this in both, in general dentistry as well as in other specialties as well. This is a little bit more complicated for you as an associate to figure out, because you don't know when the collection is coming in. So you need to have access to the software program that the practice uses to be able to see and be able to track your payments when they come in. A good practice will know ahead of time what they're going to collect. So the Delta practice that says to the patient, you know what, Delta only pays $800. That's fine. Your $400 needs to be paid up front before we start this crown. And then as soon as that crown is done, you submit for the other $400 from Delta. So a practice that has really good collection policies in place is going to be a better for you if you're under collections. That's going to be helpful to you if you're under collections versus production. I will tell you that because of the risk of collections not being collected, you probably want a little bit more of a salary. So it's hard to say this for sure because I've seen ranges all over the place, but I will say that my own opinion, production, a 30% of production would be a nice salary to take, whereas for collections, 35%. Again, because the money's not going to be coming in right away, it's going to take a while. And there's also a chance that that patient, or for example, the patient pays their $400 and guess what? They drop Delta and they didn't tell you about it. So when you go to send the money into Delta, Delta goes, sorry, the patient's no longer with us. So, you started that crown, but she wasn't covered by us at that time. So you've lost that money. So again, for production, a little lower, maybe a 30% of production is nice. And collections, I would recommend 35%. Again, those are not set in stone. Those are just my opinion. So there's a formula that you can use to see how much production you need to do to get a certain income. So I'm going to use this formula. It's at the bottom. So how much do you have to produce to say let's say you want to make $200,000 a year. So your desired income is 200,000. Okay. And the compensation rate is, I'm going to use 33% in this one just because it was easy for me to do the math. So you're at a 33% compensation rate, and the practice has a collection rate of everything about 96%. So what you do is you take that $200,000, you divide it by 0.33 times 0.96, which comes out to 0.228. When you divide that out, it turns out you have to produce $694,444 to get $200,000 on under production. If you're working 50 hours a week at 32 hours, I'm sorry, 50 weeks at 32 hours a week, not 50 hours a week. 50 weeks for 32 hours a week, that's 1,600 total hours. So you have to produce about $434 an hour in production in order to get that $200,000 in that compensation method. So that's a nice little way to figure out how much you need to produce in order to get desired income. All right, there's a couple others that we're going to talk about. One is net profit methods, which is amount collected minus expenses such as lab bills. So in this example, the full case was $5,000. There were $500 in lab fees. The profit is $4,500, and you get a percentage of that. Typically, you can negotiate with a practice that pays a percentage of the lab fee in line with your collection rate. So if you're getting 33% of collections or 33% of production, you should pay 33% of the fee for the lab bill, and the practice would pay that other 67%. Again, that kind of goes in line with what I was talking about in the beginning when the net profit of a practice, again, they might have a 35% net profit, so they have a 65% fee, so they should pay 65% of the lab fee, and you would pay 35% of the lab fee in that case. The next method of compensation is in advance. And this is a little tricky. This, again, probably is something that's going to be about 6 months, a limited time period for this. It's essentially a loan that you get against future earnings. So again, I'm just going to say a month. The first month's advance is $5,000. You're going to get $5,000 for that 1 month. Probably should up these numbers in the future. And they only collect $4,000 that they would pay you. So they didn't make that collection of 5,000, but they're still going to give that to you. And you owe, in quotes, the practice $1,000. The second month they collect $6,000. You're still going to get paid $5,000 to make up for that $1,000 that you owed from the first month. The third month collection is $7,000. They pay you $5,000 again, but they bank again, hold on to that extra $2,000. So they kind of balance this out. And after about 6 months in this way, it's nice to get this because, again, it's kind of a steady income, but it also has the incentive of you doing more work. But after about 6 months, they kind of settle up. And usually you'll come out in a positive. There might be a few $1,000s left over at the end, especially the first few months, you're going to be a little slower. The last 3 months or so, you're going to start being busier and quicker and getting used to the practice. So that's another method of compensation, and it's called an advance. So again, an indemnity practice, one that does not accept a lot of insurance contracts. They have a lot of more patients that have paying a full fee, and thus you'll be paid more for the work you do. Our payments are as payments are collected. A practice which participates in many different types of insurance plans will most likely have a lower collection of fees compared to their usual, customary, and reasonable fee. You'll therefore be paid less for the work you do, since the fees paid by the insurance companies are lower, and those from the patient will be lower as well. So again, we talked about that a little bit. Again, it's a little bit more complicated to do the collection method because you need to convince the patient of the care that's needed. You have to deliver it, and it's also depending upon the competence of the practice to collect those fees. As I mentioned, if they only have a 90% collection rate, even if they're participating, if they're not doing 96 to 98% collection, then that's a problem. So it's good to know that ahead of time, what type of collection rate does that practice have? And again, the financial policies and the office staff are very, very important in that. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there's the two main type of employee relationships. One is an independent contractor. Again, you're going to be paying over 7.5% more than you were if you were an employee, and you have to file with the IRS. Whereas the other one, when you're an employee, there's the availability possibly of health care for your family, CE benefits, retirement plan, time off, uniforms, etc. So if your family already has the health care plan, and you have other means to take care of those things, sometimes that's not as important, and maybe a little bit lower compensation might be offered. Let's say the collection was 25% instead of 30. You went to a practice, it really looks good, but they're only going to give you 25%. But they have health care, they have CE benefit, they have retirement plan, they have time off, they have uniforms, etc. All this nice perks. Then maybe it's worth having that 25% because you're getting all these other things on top. If they don't have that, then maybe you want a little higher compensation because they're not offering you all those other benefits. So getting close to the end of this part of the presentation right now, it's really important that you have your contracts reviewed by an attorney who's familiar with contract law. And make sure you hire your own attorney. Don't use the attorney that the owner used. Okay, that attorney is usually going to be the one that writes up the contract. You really want to have somebody look at the contract from your side of it. And that's important that you use a separate attorney. Again, it's going to cost you some money, but again, it's worthwhile because this is really going to be, in the long run, what you want to be happy with, or slightly unhappy with, as I said in the beginning. It's real important that you negotiate not only salary, but as we talked about, you want to negotiate the restrictive covenant. It's important that you get what you want out of this. A lot of times, if it's an older dentist that this is the first time that they're doing this, they may not really know what they're doing and may not be willing to let somebody that they really want leave the practice if the fee isn't proper for you and such like that. So in other words, if you think you're worth it and the practice really wants you, they're gonna negotiate with you a little bit and give you some more money, or give you a higher percentage, or give you some more benefits, or again that restrictive covenant buy-in. Again, if you're contemplating a buy-in or buyout, make sure you get an appraisal by an independent appraiser. It's a significant and financial investment, but it's really worthwhile to do though. And if you're going to do a buy-in or a buyout, it's also important that you have an accountant because there's tax implications on this. So you need an attorney, you need somebody to do the appraisal, and you need an accountant. Those are the resources that you really need to protect your investment and your time and such like that. So I have a number of samples of contracts that residents have given me over the year, and I don't expect you to read all these things, but I will kind of highlight some of the things that are in here. So this is the first contract, example one. So the clause in the contract notes that the employee would be expected to accept the practices, burdens, and responsibilities. That's in the highlight. So you see what I wrote to the resident. I think they need to provide you with a list of expectations of these, quote, burdens and responsibilities. That may be duties that are management duties. So that may be what they're alluding to you in there. So when they say things like this, you need to really kind of question it. Is like, what does that mean, and what am I expected to do? In this one, in B, example one again, you're expected to have evening and Saturday hours and participate equally on the on-call schedule. So you can see my notes there. Ask that the dates be spelled out in the contract, not just Saturday and evening hours. What days am I going to be working in the evening and how late? And what are my hours that evening day? Am I starting at noon and going till 9 o'clock at night? Or am I going from 8 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night? Is it every Saturday? Is it a full day? Is it a half day? Um, and I'm going to do equal on call duties. Well, do I need to physically come in after hours? If I do, is there going to be a dental assistant available if I come in after hours or on the weekend? And is it fair? You know, if I am one of three dentists and I'm only part-time, I'm only 20 hours a week, um, and the other dentists are there 30 hours a week. Is it fair to me to take equal call with them? So again, look carefully at some of the wording here and make sure that these things are spelled out for you a little bit better than just being kind of vague with say you have evening hours and Saturday hours and equally on the on-call. What does that really mean? And what's the on-call schedule actually look like? All right, this one is contract number 2 example, and the item 4 on the top of the page, I know it's a little bit hard to read it. It says that the host, and in this word, they use the word host instead of owner. I don't know why. Um, that the host would, excuse me, make records available upon request following termination of the contract. That's really good. This is very unusual, but it's a very beneficial, again, because you continue to get paid after termination. So you can ask for payments and the copies of the payments that came in. So you may not have actual access to the software because you're no longer in the office, but you want to see a printout of what was paid in for you, especially if you're on collections. And if there's a lawsuit, you really need to make sure that you have access to the patient records. So that's why it's important that you have access to the records after your termination. In item 5, this section refers to scheduling of hours that is acceptable to both the host or owner and the associate. Again, I prefer to see this spelled out in the contract, including the days and hours and the on-call schedule. That could be a separate appendix. It doesn't have to be right in the contract. It might say Appendix A lists the hours that you'd be responsible for covering the office and your days of work. And that's always negotiable. Things could happen where you're working 3 days a week and they lose another associate and they say, hey, we want you to come in 40 hours a week. So those things are always flexible and negotiable, but it's nice to make sure that that's written out for you and spelled out so that you know for sure what your responsibilities are to the office. This is one, I'm going to read this out loud. The host shall pay associate as full consideration for clinical services rendered. 30% of the amount collected, calculated per calendar, I think it's year. Host shall pay associate for clinical services rendered while associate is actively employed by a host and which results from dental treatment performed by an employee at the office. However, no payments, including commission payments, shall be made after the date the associate leaves. And you'll see my notes, I thought not paying someone for their work was illegal. A better solution would be to pay you for any work you did not, that you did, which is collected for 30 or 60 days post-employment. I've seen this clause a lot in contracts that when you leave, the payments end, and that's not fair. So you really want to negotiate that out, that you at least have a 30, 60, maybe a 90-day, especially if you're on a collections method of payment, okay? Again, if you're on production, usually they're going to pay you as soon as that production is done, but you make sure that if it's especially if you're on collections, that you have a time period afterwards where that money is still going to be coming into the office and you should get paid for that. 8B underneath, the practice is paying all lab fees, which is good considering that they're paying this particular resident 30% of collections. So they're paying 100% of the lab fees, which I thought was pretty good. So you'll see my notes. I thought a 30% was a little low, but since they're paying all lab fees, that's not so bad. However, you also need to find out if their fees are higher than other practices in the area, if they participate with other insurance plans that pay lower than their usual fee, including Medicaid, which I talked to you about. Again, this is an old one, so $1,000 crown. If they accept 700 for the insurance company, you're only getting 30% of that. Instead of 300, you're getting 210. Find out if you're considered an employee. That's some of the other notes that you'll see there. So that's some of the things that I recommended to this particular resident. Facilities, this one was good. It spells out everything you need, including an assistant. The host agrees to provide suitable treatment facilities, for performance of the associate's duties. How the associate will have the right to use the equipment, furniture, fixtures, instrument supplies, records, and personnel on the premises. So that means they get a dental assistant. At least that's how I read it. Um, and then on number 10 here, benefits, it says the practice pays. What will those benefits be? So it says associate shall provide and pay for associate's own life, disability, and professional fees and dues. Host shall not responsible to provide life and disability insurance. What about medical insurance? Find out if there's a pension plan, incentive bonus, etc. My guess in this that since they weren't going to pay for these items, they weren't going to pay for anything, but it wasn't spelled out. So I just recommended that the resident really closely look into that and see if there's other benefits that are being paid by the owner. So this one is a little bit hard to read. I'm just going to point out things in 14A. I noted that the phased-in restrictive covenant is best. It says that this one's for 2 years. I just said a restrictive covenant that's phased in is better. In 14B, it talks about the premises. I asked, are you working in multiple offices? If this so, this would expand the geographic area or radius of the restrictive covenant. Typically, and I didn't really mention this too much, in a more rural area, it's not unusual to see a 10-mile, sometimes even a 20-mile restrictive covenant, depending on how rural the area is. And I've seen 5 years, which I think are a little excessive. I think 2 years is usually acceptable. I think 5 years is a little excessive, but again, depends on how well you like the practice or you think you're going to say, and it's sometimes not worth arguing about it. But in a city, it might be 2 years and it might be a block or, like a half-mile radius or whatever. So the more densely populated in city that you are, the smaller the restrictive covenant probably will be, because that means you can't, if it's, say, a 5 mile in Philadelphia, you're out in the suburbs really already. So that's not really fair if you have, another practice in the city. So a smaller restrictive covenant geographically for a city, wider for a more rural area. And 14C, I just pointed out, this particular resident wanted to work for a federally qualified health center. So they allowed this to occur. Sometimes the restrictive covenant says you can't work anywhere within that time period in that geographic area. But since they were pretty much working at a low-income clinic, the practice didn't feel that would affect the practice. So they allowed that resident to do that. In 14D, it's again a little hard to see it, but it says something about a 4-year restrictive covenant, whereas it said 2 years up in 14A. So it should be the same. It says 2 years. You'll see my note says this is a new twist that I've never seen before. If the restrictive covenant is 2 years, this should be the clause. Should be 2 years as well. And same thing in E. They said 4 years for that restrictive part of the covenant, and it should be again 2 years. It should be consistent throughout the whole contract. All right. So this one was a huge red flag, and I'll tell you, this was a story that did not end well for the resident. So you'll see up top it says the associate deployed 32 hours per week. You'll be available for share emergency treatment of patients on weekends and after hours. Associate acknowledges that owner does not guarantee by terms of this agreement to provide a specific number of hours per week of work to the associate. Well, up above it says 32 hours, and now all of a sudden they're saying, oh, we changed our mind, we're not doing that. Associate acknowledges that no specific amount of time has been guaranteed or promised to the associate. Owner agrees to use reasonable efforts to provide business to the associate based upon the owner's overflow. So to me, this guy wasn't ready for an associate. All right. You want to make sure that the practice is busy. They have a reason for bringing you in. There might be another associate leaving. They might be growing the practice leaps and bounds, and they just can't keep up with the amount of patients that they have. Or the practice, the owner is looking to retire in a year or two, and this is their out. So this was a really, really weak term. With this restrictive covenant, which was 2 or 4 years, I couldn't tell. You could be sitting around all day twiddling your thumbs, generating no income for your family, but you can't work anywhere else. Not good. So they should, again, if he's hiring you, should hire you with a guaranteed work or salary compensation. It turned out that because the resident wasn't getting enough patients, he was working about 8 to 10 hours a week. That was it, instead of the 32. And he couldn't support his family. And there was other practices in the Allentown area This was a restrictive covenant that was 5 years and 20 miles. This took the resident past Quakertown into parts of New Jersey out toward the western part of our county. It was really bad. And the resident ended up having to leave the practice and is now in Virginia, doing very well down there. But it was really, really bad for the resident to see this and actually came true. So if you ever see this, this is a red flag, and man, you just want to run from that right away. All right. Assignment of patients. If patients do not specifically request one of the docs, there should be a rotating basis for assigning new patients to the practitioner in all fairness. So again, this is that same contract that the owner should not direct control and control the assignment of patients to the associate. It'll be made in determination of the owner and in consideration of the best interest of the patient. Again, if somebody came to the practice and said, "Hey, I want to see Dr. Smith. You know, my daughter comes here. I want to see Dr. Smith." That's fine. But if it's a new patient that calls out of the blue, then there should be an agreement where maybe every other new patient, or maybe the dentist wants to feed some of the newer patients to the new associate to keep them busy. So that's something that's kind of important to take a look at, how those patients assigned to you. Again, this was the same contract where it was, oh, okay, this was 2 years. It wasn't 5 years, but it was 20 miles. So I said to the resident that if this is ever challenged in court, you would probably win, because 20 miles in the Lehigh Valley is overly restrictive. It's primarily a suburban area growing, and 20 miles in a rural area is fine, but not in the Lehigh Valley. The problem with challenging this, if you ever do, is now you've got lawyers involved. And if anybody knows anything about lawyers, they're not real quick. They get paid by the hour, and they like to hold things up a little bit. So again, this was a bad part of the contract that I really kind of did not like. All right, 17D, example number 3 here. So in the event this agreement is terminated within 90 days of a trial period, the restrictive covenant in section 7 shall not apply. So again, this was the restrictive covenant that was phased in. This was actually a good part of a contract. So if things didn't work out in the first 3 months, they weren't bound by the restrictive covenant. I think that's, again, something I highly recommend, is to make sure that you do have a phased in restrictive covenant. So again, this was a good one. This says the partnership ability might be offered after 1 year. It says on the top, anytime following expiration of 1 year from the date of this agreement, the owner may, but is not obligated to, invite the associate to become a partner. Oop, I don't know what happened there. In the event the associate agrees to become a partner, associate agrees to pay the owner the same percentage of the value of the practice at the time of commencement of this agreement. So this was good. Again, they're evaluating the practice when the resident started to become an associate, not after they've been there for a year or so and they built the practice up. And so the last couple of slides that I were going to show you, one of them talked about the employee will be granted limited access to the business records of the employer for 365 days post-termination. Again, that was very fair, because that gives the associate a full year to collect any money that might be outstanding. Usually you don't need a full year. Usually a couple of months is fine. That's about all the time you need for that. The other one was the contract talked about the benefits. It said medical is included, but I also, oh, good. I'm glad you could pull that up. I think we're on 18A. Yep, there we go. So that's the one that says that they would have 365 days to get the business records, access to the business records. The next slide. Thank you. It says the benefits it says that medical is included, but find out what the waiting period is to become eligible. It's called vesting. So sometimes that you might be offered medical, but you have to be there a certain time before that medical benefit kicks in. And oftentimes there's an employee manual that lays that information out. It may say you get the same benefits as an employee per the employee manual. Well, you want to see that employee manual before you sign the contract, because you want to know, is there a vesting period? Is there co-pays? What other type of things are there that I didn't think about? So, and again, the last one on the next slide is the same thing. They were offering a 401k, simple IRA, and pension benefits. Again, the recommendation was to see what the waiting period for this was, if there is a waiting period. So just some of the things that are important about evaluating a contract. I hope that you got a lot of information out of this. The next slide shows some of the resources that I used for this presentation. Some of these are somewhat old, but you'll do see that the IRS website was talked about independent contractor and or an employee. I don't have any relationship to Phil Cooper. He's in South Jersey, but he would send the residents a booklet every year on contracts and associateships. So I got some of his information from there. If you are not on the New Dentist blog and you can get on that through the ADA, I recommend you get on the New Dentist blog. That's nice. It's always new dentists that are out of practice less than 10 years, and there's a lot of good information that they write, and one of them was about associateship. So those are some of the resources that I used. Amanda, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Incalcaterra, for your presentation. Our next webinar for our spring series is on CV success. It is April 23rd at 7:30 p.m. and it's about learning how to improve your resumes and CVs. So it's a really great webinar. If you want to register for this one, the QR code is on the screen. All right. And then if anyone is looking for a mentor, PDA has a program called Connections Mentoring Program. The link is on the screen here, and you can get matched with a mentor based on their location, their specialty, and their practice type. A lot of students are in this program, so if you would like to request one, you can go to the link on the screen as well. And then thank you all for coming. I will be sending out a post-event survey probably in the next day or two with the recording as well. So whenever that gets uploaded, and if you complete the survey, you will receive an Amazon gift card for doing so. And if you have any questions, you can email me at the email on the screen. And then if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat now for Dr. Calcaterra to answer.
Yeah, again, I don't have access to that being on my phone now, so I'm just not that tech savvy. So if you see any questions, please read them out to me.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm not seeing any now. So
Okay.
everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you toward the end of April.
All right, Amanda, thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Good night, everybody.